When you walk into a church that has been set up for a communion service, you'll see at the center of the altar this weird stack of things with colored cloths and everything on it. I'm going to explain what is there and why it's there, just so that you understand what's going on, because you look at it and think, what's that weird thing in the center? Well, this is what it is. At the very bottom, first, what's lying on the communion table is a linen cloth. Linen because that was what God had ordered for the temple and the tabernacle in the Old Testament. And onto it is another smaller linen cloth, a square cloth usually, called a corporal. Corporal from the Latin word meaning body. It is everything that is on the corporal. Once we do the prayer of consecration during the Eucharist service, that we say that the elements, the wine and the bread, have become a representation of the body of Christ. And without going into the details of whether that's transubstantiation or consubstantiation or any of the other debates, I will simply say that it is a representation in some form or other of the body and blood of Christ as he commanded us to celebrate it. So the corporal is important because everything that's on it is going to be consecrated and therefore becomes holy. Prior to that, bread and wine is just ordinary bread and wine, and people can eat it and drink it however they like. So the first thing that's down on the table is a corporal. Then the chalice is placed upon it in the center. Onto the chalice, simply for simplicity, none of this is required, it's simply the way that things are done, is a cloth called a purificator, which will be used to wipe the chalice once people have sipped. And interestingly on that issue is that when you give someone the chalice to sip, they take it, they sip, you wipe where they've sipped with the purificator, and then you turn it about 90 degrees so that the next person is sipping from a different place. And during the SARS epidemic in 2002 in Canada, they did research on essentially how dangerous it was to share communion wine. And what they discovered is that between the alcohol in the wine and the precious metals that the chalices are made of, it's actually the most sanitary form of taking a shared cup, because these precious metals seem to have an antiseptic and antibiotic character to them, and by wiping and turning, it actually was a very low risk way of sharing. Other forms of taking communion, especially where you dunk bread into the cup, called intinction, is actually the most risky of all the ways to take communion. So the purificator is placed like this simply to keep the pattern, which is the next thing that goes onto it, from clinking against the chalice. The pattern is just a simple little plate, usually made of metal as well. Onto it we either place the bread or the wafers that we're going to use for the celebration of the Eucharist service. Onto that is placed what is called the pall, which just covers it. Now you have to understand, part of this actually, although it looks like it's all very ornate and so on, most of it simply grew out of the practicalities of medieval churches and cathedrals. Often had birds and bats living in the ceiling. They were cold, they were drafty, and there was an attempt to try and keep this thing clean and sacred from droppings and various things like that. And so these kinds of things like the pall was simply there to keep everything nice and clean. Onto it goes what we call the veil, which is simply a square cloth, often very ornate, that we lay over it. This is a fairly simple one, all in green, of course, which is the color for ordinary time, which simply, again, keeps everything clean and tidy. Onto that is placed what is called a burse, from which we get the English word purse. And the burse is simply a card that holds a little purse that holds a spare purificator, so that should wine be spilt or should we need an extra one, we have one on hand. And so this is what you would see normally when you come into a service, if it's set up for a Eucharist celebration, that this stack is here. And that is the reasons why it is the way it is.